They say the worst kind of treachery doesn't hide in the dark. It strolls in with polished shoes and a practiced grin. The room buzzed with applause and clinking glasses when Daniel realized his name was gone. Not overlooked. Not misplaced. Just erased. The museum project, his design, his vision, now belonged to Miranda Lane, the firm's rising star. She stood beneath the spotlight, charming the board with borrowed brilliance, casually throwing around terms Daniel had once explained to her over lukewarm coffee and late nights. He said nothing. Not yet. He observed. The way she danced around the engineering flaws. The way she parroted phrases without understanding the bones beneath them. He watched the partners beam with approval. The interns watched her like a TED Talk come to life. And then she looked at him, just for a flicker of a second. Enough to say, I won. She was sure he wouldn't do a thing. Because Daniel had always been the quiet one. The background guy. The one who fixed things and didn't take credit. The one no one saw coming. But Miranda forgot something vital. Daniel didn't just draft blueprints. He studied pressure. He understood collapse. And he knew exactly where to tap to bring down a facade. This time, he wasn't going to stay silent. Daniel had always been the kind of person who entered a room without shifting its temperature. He moved through the office like a steady current, reliable, unseen, essential. People liked him well enough. They liked that he never missed a deadline, that he sent thoughtful emails, that he brought the right kind of muffins to Monday meetings. But they didn't really see him. Not in the way that counted. Not in the way that earned headlines, attention, or promotions. That kind of spotlight belonged to people like Miranda. She arrived a few years after him, full of polish and edge, the kind of person who could turn small talk into strategy and walk into a boardroom as if it were built for her. Her voice carried. Her confidence glittered. She had a way of looking at you that made you feel she already knew your weaknesses and had ranked them in order of inconvenience. Miranda had ambition, and ambition looked good in this place. It made clients feel excited, like they were part of something bold. It made senior partners feel smart for hiring her. And it made people like Daniel seem safe, predictable, useful in the background, but never the star of the presentation. He didn't resent her at first. She asked questions, took notes, leaned in when he explained structural integrity or spatial flow. She'd swing by his desk casually, toss out a compliment on one of his sketches, ask how he'd solved a tricky support issue. It felt collaborative. She was learning. But over time, the questions shifted, became more specific, more curated. She didn't come to understand the design. She came to absorb it. Piece by piece, his ideas reemerged in meetings, slightly reworded, wrapped in smoother packaging. He noticed. Others didn't. She started being invited to client sessions, started receiving compliments for her vision. She repeated his solutions to problems she never sat with, never solved, and always with just enough flair that the room applauded her innovation. When she presented early concepts for the museum design, people were stunned by her insight. Daniel watched from the back, heart tightening, not because he wanted applause, but because he recognized every line on the screen. He had drawn them. Still, he said nothing. It wasn't in his nature to accuse or to rush to defense. He believed work spoke for itself. He believed people noticed more than they said. He believed that what you build, if strong enough, would stand on its own. But over time, the silence around him thickened. Conversations passed over his desk. Invitations didn't land in his inbox. Feedback came wrapped in polite excuses. We're looking for a fresher perspective. We need someone with a more dynamic presence. Miranda just has a way of connecting with stakeholders. He became the guy who made things work behind the scenes. The backbone. The support beam. Important, but invisible. Still, he came in early. Stayed late. Reviewed code compliance documents others skipped. Triple-checked measurements. Filled gaps no one noticed. He adjusted models so they wouldn't buckle under real-world conditions. He sent ideas, refinements, and notes to Miranda, and she used them, without acknowledgement. He wasn't bitter. Not exactly. It was something quieter. A slow, dull ache that settled between his ribs. A sense that he was disappearing in full view. The museum project changed everything. It was the biggest contract the firm had landed in years. Public, high stakes, legacy defining. Daniel had started sketching ideas for it before the RFP was even finalized. His designs balanced the history of the old building with the modern lines the city craved. He worked through weekends, refining transitions between glass and stone, calculating angles for natural light, ensuring accessibility without sacrificing aesthetics. Miranda showed interest early on, unusually early. She lingered near his desk longer, asked to bounce ideas around, offered to gather feedback on his behalf. At first, he didn't question it. Collaboration was supposed to be part of the process. But something shifted after the preliminary review. Files went missing. Drafts were saved under new names. He started to notice small edits in his work, subtle changes that tilted things off balance. Nothing major, but enough to raise questions. Enough to cause doubt. Enough that if something went wrong, it would look like his fault. Then the partners announced that Miranda would be leading the final design presentation. Daniel wasn't informed. He read it on a calendar invite forwarded by mistake. His name wasn't on the agenda. Still, he stayed quiet. He watched. He made notes. What others didn't realize, what even Miranda didn't seem to notice, was that Daniel wasn't just a draftsman. His experience reached further back and ran deeper than anyone assumed. Before the clean offices and the design software and the polished renderings, he had worked hands-on, real materials, real pressure, real failure. He knew how beams twisted under load, how concrete settled, how wind moved through spaces. He understood that beauty without stability was performance, not architecture. And he had seen enough performances. Miranda's version of the museum was stunning, but Daniel saw the fractures, the stress points that had been ignored, the aesthetic choices that violated code, the shortcuts taken to impress. It wasn't personal. It was technical. The design wouldn't just be flawed, it would be dangerous. And yet, everyone applauded. Everyone assumed Miranda had pulled it off on her own. They assumed Daniel was the nice guy who handed over ideas because he didn't know any better, that he was content being in the background, that he didn't notice. But he had noticed everything. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something shift, not in the world around him, but inside. A quiet resolve rising through the layers of years spent making things right behind the scenes. They had underestimated the wrong man. And now, the foundation they stood on was about to be tested. Most people in the office saw Daniel as a technician, a steady hand behind the screen, someone who followed directions and delivered clean results. Few, if any, ever wondered where his precision came from. Even fewer cared. But long before Daniel learned to polish floor plans and color-code digital elevations, he learned how buildings feel. Not in theory, but in practice. His first exposure to architecture wasn't in a classroom, it was in the field. He'd grown up surrounded by sawdust, steel, and sweat, following his father from one job site to another. His earliest memories were filled with the scent of drying concrete, the weight of a level in his small hands, and the rhythmic hum of a tape measure sliding home. It wasn't glamorous work. His father never wore a suit. He never won awards. But he understood how structures breathed, how a beam could tell you it was under stress just by the sound it made, how a foundation could whisper its secrets if you knew where to knock. Those years built Daniel in a way blueprints never could. Later, when he went to school for architecture, he found himself ahead in ways his classmates couldn't quite explain. While they memorized formulas, he could feel the difference between a good design and a dangerous one. While others debated angles and aesthetics, he understood the physics hidden in the bones of every structure. His professors admired his instincts. They called him a natural. But in the professional world, instincts didn't always win contracts. Appearances did. And Daniel didn't play the game. He never posted his work on social media. He never networked at design expos. He didn't know how to sell ideas, only how to build them. So while others climbed quickly, his progress was slow, quiet, dismissed. But he never stopped learning. His evenings, long after office hours, were spent poring over obscure engineering manuals, reverse engineering historical buildings, designing efficient, sustainable housing for low-income neighborhoods that would never see the inside of a firm's portfolio. Not because he expected recognition because it mattered. Because he knew the systems were flawed. Because people deserved structures that wouldn't fail them when the lights went out or the funding ran dry. He had dozens of these side projects saved under folders no one else had seen. Compact housing designed to be erected by hand. Emergency shelters that could survive coastal storms. Minimalist community centers that harvested their own power. He treated architecture not as a career, but as quiet resistance against neglect. It was this quiet, unpolished drive that birthed the original version of the museum design. Long before Miranda ever showed interest, Daniel had spent months shaping that blueprint. He wanted the space to speak. A fusion of past and present, raw limestone supporting an airy glass crown, echoing the city's industrial roots without becoming a cold monument. The design was more than visual, it was experiential. Every detail had a purpose. Every material had a story. He had submitted the draft in pieces, not because he lacked confidence, but because the firm valued polish over process. Miranda had offered to help him position the concept. She said she could help frame it in a way the partners would find exciting. He agreed. He believed in collaboration. He believed in the work. But now, looking at her version, Daniel barely recognized it. She'd altered core elements, removed support structures to make way for aesthetics, swapped sustainable materials for trendier, more expensive ones. The integrity of the design had been hollowed out to make room for buzzwords and spectacle. On the surface, it gleamed. Underneath, it cracked. He knew the model wouldn't hold. The weight distribution along the mezzanine walkways had been shifted without recalculating load. The glass dome lacked the reinforcement needed for seasonal expansion and contraction. Drainage solutions were cut entirely, replaced with seamless lines that photographers would love and inspectors would hate. What disturbed him most wasn't that she took the credit. It was that she didn't understand the harm her edits could cause, not just to the building, but to the people inside it. A beautiful failure was still a failure. No one would care about the award if a leak ruined a 100-year-old mural or if a structural failure forced a shutdown within its first year. Daniel didn't want to be vindicated later. He wanted the museum to stand. So he went back to the original files. Every line, every angle, every stress test he'd run, he compiled them. Quietly, methodically, he reconstructed the truth. He cross-checked building codes. He reran the climate simulations. He dug through Miranda's version of the design, highlighting every omission, every danger, every corner cut in the name of flair. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about recognition. It was about responsibility. He remembered what his father once said. As they rebuilt a collapsed entryway on a community shelter, people can't see what holds a place up, but they know when it falls. Daniel had built too much, fixed too many mistakes, to watch this one slip by. The firm had already set the date for the investor presentation. Everything was locked. Everyone was excited. Daniel wasn't on the list. But he had the real design, the one that worked. And now, as the clock ticked toward the presentation, he wasn't planning to stop it. He was planning to reveal what was underneath. The day of the investor presentation arrived with the kind of bright, manic energy that buzzed through the halls like caffeine. The office hummed. Suits were sharper. Laughter was louder. People scurried between print stations and conference rooms like everything about the future depended on this one moment. In a way, it did. The museum contract meant prestige, visibility, awards, a public stamp of relevance that could catapult the firm into a different league entirely. It wasn't just a project, it was legacy. And Miranda was positioned at its center, polished and poised, exactly as she had planned. Daniel watched the whirlwind from a distance, unnoticed. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. The storm wasn't his. Not really. He wasn't part of the guest list. His name wasn't on the planning board. No one expected him to show up in the meeting. And that was the advantage. He had moved through the cracks of their assumptions long enough to learn how to operate within them. While others broadcasted, he listened. While they pushed forward with showmanship, he had built something that could stand. And now, he would let it speak for itself. Earlier that morning, Daniel had quietly uploaded a secure folder into the firm's internal server. The file contained his complete structural analysis, precise, calm, irrefutable. He marked every deviation from the original design, calculated the risks, cross-referenced every one of Miranda's changes with potential code violations, long-term maintenance concerns, and the projected environmental impact. It was not an emotional document. It was a blueprint for consequences. At the top, he added a note, simple, factual, time-stamped. He didn't name names. He didn't accuse. He let the data speak. And then he waited. The meeting began in the largest conference space the firm had. City officials, museum board members, journalists, and high-tier donors filed in with the kind of glossy interest reserved for groundbreaking things. Screens lit up. The model rotated in slow, elegant loops. Applause echoed. The future shimmered. But then, small things began to happen. Someone noticed a mismatch in the structural report. A quiet comment. Then another. A senior partner leaned toward their laptop, eyes narrowing. A building inspector, flipping through the handout, paused mid-page. The room didn't change all at once. It shifted subtly, like a building settling into its foundation. Questions surfaced. So did the file. It had made its way to every key decision-maker before the first pitch even ended. The document didn't scream. It didn't blame. But it held weight. And in a room full of people who knew what failures cost, weight mattered. Miranda's charm began to falter. The model, once celebrated, was re-examined. That perfect dome? A liability under thermal expansion. The floating mezzanine? An elegant trap for structural fatigue. The minimal drainage? A lawsuit waiting to happen. The shimmer dulled. From his desk, several floors above the conference room, Daniel didn't watch the meeting. He didn't need to. His focus wasn't on reactions, it was on outcomes. The firm prided itself on vision. But vision without structure collapsed. He had built the structure. They were only now realizing who had given it its bones. Later, word spread. A closed-door meeting was called. Miranda's name wasn't whispered with the same admiration anymore. Some partners looked pale. Some looked furious. Others were eerily quiet, reprocessing what they'd chosen not to see for years. Daniel was asked to explain the discrepancies in a technical review. No flair. No politics. Just facts. His quiet presence, once easy to overlook, now held a strange gravity. Not because he demanded it. Because it had always been there, they'd simply ignored the weight. No one apologized. But something shifted. People started citing his analysis during follow-ups. His name began appearing in meeting notes, CC'd on planning emails, invited to discussions about revisions. His original design, sensible, sustainable, elegant in its logic, became the foundation again. Miranda was reassigned quietly. Not fired. Not publicly shamed. Just absorbed elsewhere, far from high-stakes projects. She didn't look at Daniel in the halls anymore. But it wasn't about her. Daniel wasn't interested in punishment. What mattered was that the building would stand. That the people who walked through the museum wouldn't know how close they came to a failure that would have left them cold, wet, or in danger. What mattered was the integrity of the thing itself. And the message that followed in silence. That sometimes, the person you assume is just a shadow is the one who built the ceiling over your head. That underestimation is a kind of structural flaw, and eventually, it gives way. The days that followed were not loud. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public unravelings. Just a series of quiet corrections, meetings held in smaller rooms, documents resent with new names attached. The revised blueprint, Daniel's version, was now the working model. It was praised for its elegance, its responsibility, its foresight. Internally, it was referred to as a return to core principles, as if the course correction had always been part of the plan. The firm protected its image, of course. It always had. But behind the polished press releases and careful statements, everyone knew what had happened. Not just to the design, but to the story. Daniel, who had once been invisible in meetings, now found seats pulled out for him before he arrived. His assessments, once skimmed, were now read line by line. Junior staff started approaching him with questions, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to understand how he saw things the way he did. Not just what he built, but why it worked. Still, he spoke sparingly. He never claimed a title. He didn't correct people when they assumed this had always been the plan. He didn't mention what had been taken, or how long he'd been overlooked. He simply stayed the course, careful, steady, deliberate. But beneath that calm, something had shifted. There was a weight lifted that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The quiet frustration of being unseen, of having to choose between doing the right thing or doing what would be noticed, that weight was gone. He hadn't forced respect. He had earned clarity. And with that clarity came space. Space to begin other designs he'd shelved. Space to mentor younger designers who reminded him of himself. Space to revisit old drafts with new confidence, no longer wondering whether they were good enough, but knowing they were true. And elsewhere, ripple effects began to show. A senior architect quietly adopted some of Daniel's sustainability strategies in his own portfolio. A project manager began insisting on peer reviews with more technical oversight. Even the tone of leadership changed subtly, but noticeably. Less flash, more substance. The unspoken message had sunk in. Excellence wasn't always loud. Sometimes it walked the halls without a nameplate. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it built its case in silence and let gravity do the rest. In the break room, one of the younger interns had printed out a structural sketch from Daniel's original draft and pinned it to the corkboard. No caption, no credit, just lines, precise, balanced, clean. It stayed up for weeks. Daniel passed by it once, on his way to a meeting. He paused for just a second, not to admire it, just to remember the moment it had been drawn, late at night, long before anyone had believed it mattered. Now it did. And not because he demanded a spotlight, but because the structure spoke for itself. That was the shift. Not revenge, not recognition, just quiet, undeniable truth, finally standing where it always belonged. Time didn't freeze after it happened. The world kept turning, deadlines resumed, and meetings filled with the same buzz of jargon and urgency. But under the surface, something essential had changed. Not just in the office, but in Daniel. He had never set out to expose anyone. That had never been the goal. His life hadn't been built around vengeance or public redemption. It had been built in the margins, on long nights, in quiet effort, through years of choosing substance over spotlight. And maybe that's why it worked. Because it wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. Of the craft. Of integrity. Of the things that outlast style and strategy. There were still moments when the sting of it all would catch him unexpectedly. A memory resurfacing. The moment Miranda presented his words as her own. The look on her face when others clapped for her insight. His silence in that moment. He had let it happen. Too many times. But he understood now. Silence was never the absence of power. It was the storing of it. The system had underestimated him because it had been trained to overlook anyone who didn't demand to be seen. That was the flaw. Not just in people like Miranda, but in the structure itself. A culture where showmanship passed for merit and quiet consistency was treated like wallpaper. But structure always tells the truth. Eventually, what Daniel built stood. Not just the museum's design, but the culture it quietly reshaped. Colleagues asked more questions now. Assumptions were challenged. Senior staff made room for voices that once would have been dismissed. He watched from the sidelines, not seeking credit, but knowing exactly what had started the change. And outside the firm, the museum was taking shape, stone by stone, beam by beam, based on his vision. Families would walk those halls, unaware of how close it came to being something fragile and false. Children would run through rooms filled with art and history, protected by steel and math and a man they would never meet. He didn't need them to know. What mattered was that it would stand, that it was sound, that it was right. In the quiet moments, when the office lights dimmed and most people had gone home, Daniel would sometimes stand at the window and look out at the city. The skyline wasn't just buildings. It was stories. Some loud, some forgotten, some never told. His story didn't need to be loud. It only needed to last. By the way, like what you just heard, hit subscribe and get ready for more thought-provoking tales.